Chapter 4. The Missing Dumbbell.
Holmes called the butler in.
Can you remember, Ames, what Mr. Barker was wearing on his feet when you joined him in the study?
Yes, Mr. Holmes. He had a pair of bedroom slippers on. I brought him his boots when he went for the police.
Where are the slippers now?
They are still under a chair in the hall.
Good. It's important to know which footprints belong to Mr. Barker and which come from outside.
Yes, sir. I noticed that the slippers were marked with blood, sir. So were mine.
Thank you, Ames.
We returned to the study. Holmes brought the slippers with him from the hall. The slippers were dark with blood.
Strange,
said Holmes. He was examining the slippers by the light of the window.
Very strange indeed.
He placed the slipper on the bloodstain under the window. It matched exactly. Holmes looked at the others. MacDonald looked excited. Barker made the mark under the window himself. What's going on, Holmes? What does it mean?
That's the question,
said Holmes.
What does it mean?
The three detectives had many small details to investigate. I decided to return to the village on my own. I walked through the garden of the house. At the far end was a hedge of yew trees. Behind these was a stone seat, hidden from view. As I approached, I heard some voices coming from the area of the stone seat. I came around the trees and saw Mrs. Douglas and Mr. Barker. They did not see me straight away. I was shocked by Mrs. Douglas's appearance. Before, she had been very quiet. Now her eyes were shining, and she was laughing at something Barker had just said. Barker was also smiling. Just too late they both saw me and assumed more serious expressions. They spoke briefly to each other. Then Barker got up and walked towards me.
"Excuse me, sir, but are you Dr. Watson? Mrs. Douglas wants to ask you something."
I did not really want to talk to her. I saw clearly in my mind the body of the dead man lying on the floor. Here, only a few hours after the tragedy, was his wife laughing with another man. But I went over to them.
"You're a good friend of Mr. Holmes. Tell me,"
she asked,
"if I told him something, does he have to tell the detectives? Is he working on his own, or is he with them?"
"Mr. Holmes is independent," I replied, "but he won't hide anything from the detectives. You must ask Holmes himself." I left them and continued walking. When I told Holmes what had happened, he said that he did not want to hear anything from them.
It can get complicated if we have to make an arrest for murder,
he said. "Why, have you solved it, Holmes?"
Oh, not yet. But when we find the missing dumbbell...
The dumbbell?
Watson, you must realize how important that missing dumbbell is. What use is one dumbbell?
He continued talking.
A lie, Watson. That's what we have here. A great big lie. Barker's story is a lie, and Mrs. Douglas is helping him. They are both lying. So, why are they lying, and what is the truth that they are trying to hide?
"How can you be so sure they're lying?" I asked.
Because it simply can't be true. According to their story, the murderer had less than a minute after the murder to take the wedding ring, which was under another ring, then to replace the other ring and put the card by the victim. This is impossible. I don't think that the ring was taken before the victim was killed. The candle was lit for only a short time. I think the murderer was alone with the dead man for some time with the lamp lit. but the gunshot was the cause of death. Therefore, the gun was fired much earlier than we have been told. So the two people who heard the gunshot, Mr. Barker and Mrs. Douglas, are obviously both lying for some reason. And now we can also show that Barker put the footprint under the window. It doesn't look good for Barker. So, what time did the murder actually occur? The housekeeper said she heard a noise at about 11:15, about half an hour before Barker called them. I think that this was the gunshot and the real time of the murder. If I'm correct, what were Mr. Barker and Mrs. Douglas doing, if they aren't the actual murderers, from 11:15 when they heard the shot to 11:15 when they rang the bell for the servants?
I'm sure there is something going on between those two, I agreed. Do you think they are guilty of the murder? I asked.
I think that Mr. Barker and Mrs. Douglas know the truth about this murder. I'm not sure that they are the murderers themselves. I think that an evening alone in the study will help a lot. Can I borrow your umbrella, please, Watson?
I was confused, but I gave him my umbrella anyway. Later that evening, Inspector MacDonald and Mr. Mason returned. They had found out more about the owner of the bicycle. He was an American who was staying at a hotel in the nearby town of Tunbridge Wells. According to the people at the hotel, he was a tall, handsome man of about 50. He was dressed in a grey suit and a short yellow coat and cap.
He sounds very similar to Mr. Douglas,
remarked Holmes. Holmes told the detectives about his theories and what he intended to do that evening. The detectives asked if they could help.
No,
said Holmes.
All I need is darkness and Watson's umbrella. Chapter 5. The mystery is solved.
The next morning, the detectives were trying to find the owner of the bicycle.
Any luck?
Asked Holmes. Well, so far we have reports of a man in a yellow coat in Leicester, Nottingham, Southampton and Liverpool. The country seems to be full of people in yellow coats, replied MacDonald. What about you? Did you find out anything last night?
I can't really tell you at the moment. However, I have found out that Charles I was once hidden in this house for several days during the Civil War,
said Holmes. I don't see what that has to do with this case, said Mason.
Well, I want to give you both some advice. I can't tell you everything that I know yet, but my advice to you is to abandon the case for today. Meet me here this evening, and things will become clear.
The detectives were not very happy about this, but eventually agreed.
One more thing. I want you to write a letter to Mr. Barker. Write this down. Dear Sir, we have decided to drain the moat in the hope that we may find some...
MacDonald interrupted. It's impossible. We've already made inquiries.
In the hope that we may find something which will help in the case. I have made arrangements, and the workmen will begin tomorrow morning. Now, sign that and deliver it this afternoon. Then meet me here when it gets dark.
The detectives were obviously annoyed, but agreed to do as Holmes asked. Later that evening, Holmes took us outside into the grounds of the manor house. We stopped opposite the windows of the study. Now what? Asked MacDonald.
We must wait,
said Holmes.
We need to be patient.
We waited and waited. What exactly are we waiting for? Asked MacDonald finally. And how much longer do we have to wait?
I don't know how long we'll have to wait, but I can tell you what we are waiting for. Look, that's what we're waiting for.
As he spoke, we saw a man open the window of the study. We heard the splashing of water as the man searched for something. Then, suddenly, we saw him raise a large, round object from the moat and take it into the study.
"Now!"
shouted Holmes.
"Now!"
We all jumped to our feet and ran into the house and into the study. There was Cecil Barker.
"What do you want?"
he said.
"That's what we want,"
said Holmes.
"that package, weighted with the dumbbell that you have just pulled from the moat."
"How do you know about it?"
"Well, I put it there.
said Holmes.
Or rather, I replaced it there, after hooking it out last night with the handle of Watson's umbrella."
He opened the package. Inside was a pair of boots, a grey suit, a yellow coat, and a dangerous-looking knife.
The label in the coat is from Vermissa, USA. Earlier today, I found out that Vermissa is a mining valley. Perhaps the VV on the card might stand for Vermissa Valley, and may even be the Valley of Fear, I think. This seems clear. Perhaps you could explain further, Mr. Barker.
asked Holmes. Barker did not know what to say. Eventually he said,
"Well, if you know such a lot, Holmes, why don't you tell us?"
Mrs. Douglas came in. She had heard everything.
You have done enough for us, Cecil. Whatever happens in the future, you have done enough.
More than enough,
said Holmes.
Now I think it is time to hear the truth from Mr. Douglas himself.
We were all astonished at Holmes's words. As he spoke, a man seemed to have come out from the wall in a dark corner of the room. Mrs. Douglas turned and put her arms around her husband.
I'm sure it's best this way, John,
she said. The man looked at us. He came to me and gave me a package.
"I've heard of you,"
he said.
"Well, Dr. Watson, you've never heard a story like this one. Tell it your own way, but these are the facts. I've been hiding in there for 2 days, and I've written it all down. This is the story of the Valley of Fear."
MacDonald was staring at John Douglas in amazement. "Well, if you're John Douglas, whose murder have we been investigating for the past 2 days? And where did you just come from?"
Don't you remember me telling you that Charles I was once hidden in this house?
Holmes reminded him.
When I found the clothes in the moat, it became clear that the body was not that of John Douglas, but must be the body of the cyclist from Tunbridge Wells. So, then I had to find out where Mr. Douglas was hiding.
"He's right. I won't start at the beginning,"
said John Douglas.
"But there are some men who won't leave me alone until I'm dead. They forced me out of America. I wanted to spend my last years here in peace. I never told my wife how things were because I didn't want to worry her. I was in Tunbridge Wells the day before these events, and I saw a man in the street who I recognized immediately. He was my worst enemy, so I knew that there was trouble coming. I came home and prepared myself. All day I was nervous, but when the drawbridge was up, I felt safe. Then, when I was checking the lights before going to bed, I saw his boot under the curtain. I put down the candle, and he jumped out at me and got the gun from under his coat. We were fighting, and I was trying to take the gun out of his hands before he could fire. Maybe it was me that pulled the trigger, or maybe it just went off in the fight. Anyway, he took the shot full in the face. I was looking at all that was left of Ted Baldwin. I was in shock when I heard Barker and my wife coming. I ran to the door and stopped her. We thought that the servants would be there any minute, but they didn't come. They hadn't heard anything. That was when I thought of the plan. The man has the same mark as I have, the mark of the lodge. He was also about the same height and size as me. His face was unrecognizable. We tied his clothes to the dumbbell and threw them out of the window. Then we put my clothes on him. The card that was meant for my body was lying by his, and we put my ring on his finger. I didn't want to part with my wedding ring, but as you can see, I can't get it off anyway. I put a plaster on his chin where I have one myself at the moment. I thought that if I could hide for a while, we might at last have a chance to live the rest of our lives in peace. So I hid in the hiding place, and Barker did what he had to do. He made the mark by the window, and then, when everything was fixed, he rang the bell for the servants. That's the truth.
Holmes looked serious.
I don't think this story is over yet, Mr. Douglas. I see trouble ahead.
And now, let us go back 20 years in time and travel thousands of miles to the west, so that I can tell you the beginning of this terrible story of John Douglas. And then we will meet in the rooms of Baker Street once more to hear how it ends.